Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. Rachel was my first guest on the podcast, so I'm excited to have her back for episode number 50, halfway to 100. She shares how she supports bereaved with her tried and true methods, which she found to be helpful in her own personal loss. You can check out Rachel's personal story in episode 1, season 1. Also today, we are starting something new. Some of my guests will have a gift for you, which you'll receive by going to my website and find podcast gift in the navigation bar. Simply enter the password, which in Rachel's case is the word 50, as in the episode number, and you'll receive her ebook about grief myth once you add your name and email address. But for now, make sure to make notes of what Rachel is going to share with us. About this week's guest. Helping people through grief is Rachel's passion. After her baby daughters died in 2008, she made a promise to them that she'll learn how to heal after loss and share what she's learned with everyone who wants to heal too. Rachel has spent more than a decade making good on her promise and has helped hundreds of clients build a meaningful and purposeful life after loss. Please enjoy today's show. So welcome, Rachel. I'm so excited to speak to you again. Rachel, how are you today, first of all?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Thank you.
So Rachel has been the very first guest on this podcast. So if you haven't listened to her story, go back to season 1, episode 1, and you can find Rachel's story. So I'm so excited to speak to you again. And we're already in season 5. And for those of you who've been listening, season 5, I've sort of already started introducing in season 4 people intercepted with interview with people who are bereaved, but also who work with bereaved people or traumatized people. And so Rachel is a grief expert as well as a personally bereaved mom, and she's also coaching people after loss. But tell us a little bit how you came from your personal experience into the world of supporting others. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my daughters died in 2008. So this is over 15 years ago. So it's been a decade and a half that I found myself thrown into the grief community against my will. It's not ever a place I wanted to be. It was never even on my radar. But when Aubrey and Ellie died, I was grieving and I was trying to figure out what my next step was going to be. And at the time, which I think it's hard to even imagine, there wasn't a lot of information. Even with the internet, it was sort of at its beginning. Instagram didn't even exist. The way Facebook functioned was very different. I was still meeting other grieving moms in AOL chat rooms. Things have changed so much. But one of the things I was so hungry for was encouragement and information, because I was bombarded with lots of contradicting information. It was hard for me to actually find anybody who could give me a straight answer about what I was headed into or what grief was like, what life was going to look like. And the biggest thing that I was told on repeat was that grief is forever and a mom who loses a baby is never going to be okay. But I just couldn't accept that. I just couldn't. I don't know what it was about hearing that I said, that cannot be possible. That cannot be my future. Grief, how can grief be forever? How will I move on with my life and be a good mom to my 2.5-year-old son if grief is forever? So I took a deep dive. I kind of was stubborn about it and said, I don't accept this. and I refused to give up on figuring out what other options I had through my grief. And that first 5 years I spent after Aubrey and Ellie died was a hard 5 years. It was lonely. It was exhausting. It was overwhelming. And I promised myself that when I figured out how to put the pieces of my heart back together again, I would not keep it to myself, and I would share it with anybody who wanted to know, because the grief school of hard knocks that I went through to eventually discover that I was right. Grief is not forever, and healing is possible after loss. And we have so many choices over our own heart. It came at a cost to me, though. It came at a lot of years of really hard moments, misinformation that I had to figure out and dig through, mistakes that I made that I'd have to unmake. And I just remember thinking, how in the world, I'm not the first person to grieve. I certainly will not be the last person to grieve. So why am I being treated? Or I just felt that I was all alone in my grief and my grief journey. And I wanted to make sure that nobody ever felt as alone as I did. And nobody else had to make as many mistakes and learn as much the hard way as I did, just to find the healing that's actually possible after loss.
It's interesting now when you say there wasn't a lot of material out there. This is probably one of the sentences that I hear most from new clients. I can't find the resources that I need. And I was just wondering whether it is more a testament of the time that they're looking, or more a fact of that basically people come into this arena of grief after the loss of a significant person in their life, and they are not trained. I mean, whoever trains about what am I going to do when I lose the love of my life or my children or whatever, we're not prepared for that. And yes, the internet has become much more an accessible place to look for resources, and you can use Google and search grief. But then it's really the question of how to find the thing that helps you in your personal situation. So how did you find, and what did you find useful in your situation with grief?
Well, I think back to that time, and I remember this is how you and I even met,
Exactly.
because you were writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we both had that deep sense of, now that we've gotten ourselves through the hardest part of our grief, we wanted to share information because we were both equally as frustrated and had our own unique experience through not having enough information or even dealing with misinformation. And we were very focused on helping to improve that situation and help grievers not feel confused and alone and overwhelmed. And so I saw a shift at that time with a lot of us, right? You were writing books, and you've written many books since then. That's not your only one. But I think what I've learned the most is that information and support, when they're combined, that's when progress is actually made. Because so much of my time and energy was spent sorting out information before I even had a chance to apply it and have it actually affect or benefit my life. Because so much of the information was wrong, or confusing, or limited, or was just part of the information, and I needed the other half. I was missing information. And all of that time and energy trying to sort out information, I'm grateful for it looking back because of how it's benefited my life and so many of my clients. But at the time, it was incredibly difficult because I had to just grit my teeth and endure, because I didn't have enough information to actually apply it to my life so that I could get relief and healing and start moving myself forward. And so that's my goal today, is to create the information that's already vetted, that I know is already helpful and beneficial, that eliminates that confusion or incompleteness, so that when you apply the information that I have, you get instant relief and you feel yourself moving and shifting through your grief and through your pain as soon as you start applying the information. You don't have to wait months or years like I did to finally get the benefit of sorting it all out. Because you're right, we're not born with this magic download in our brain that says, when the worst imaginable thing happens to you, here's how to handle it. Grief skills are life skills. They have to be learned, just like we learn how to be married or how to parent. or how to adult, we have to learn how to grieve. But we're learning how to grieve at a time in our life when we're completely emotionally and physically depleted. So we're being asked to do one of the hardest things we've ever had to do at a time when we are least capable. So it's a big ask. So being able to access beneficial support along with beneficial information helps you build up the strength and the resilience that you need to actually move forward, because it's a lot to carry all by yourself. It's possible, but the process is significantly more doable, more accomplishable with support and correct information.
Yeah, I like the fact that you sort of put those different life skills in a comparison, in terms of when you said we have to learn to adult, we have to learn to mother. And sort of one thing that stuck out to me when I became a mother, I also didn't know what it meant and what specifically my child was experiencing at different stages of her development. And they are mothering support. They are places you go to that teach you why things might not be working, even with lactating consultants. And being a young mother, you're probably also quite depleted, and you have like this short-term support that you have that you can go back to. And in grieving, the same, as you said, you were in a situation where we're so emotionally, physically, mentally depleted. Then we have to learn about how do I do that, which is so important. One thing I wanted to ask you as well is that just the last few weeks, I've heard this again, where two of my new clients said to me that they were pushed back in a way from charities or doctors or grief workers, I call them now without going into specific like psychotherapists or whatever, that they said to them, it's too early for you to get support. Like one lady just today, she said charity pushed her back and say, not in the first 8 weeks. And to me, I'm puzzled by that. I wonder why there is this time period where people seem to not either be able, due to regulations and rules or finances, I don't know, or they don't think that they can help in the early times of grief. What is your thought on that?
I think grief is really scary and overwhelming. And the support that people need through grief does change. It's not a one size fits all. It's not just here's a manual and do these 5 things and that's grief support. And so I think when it comes to whether it's charities or external organizations, even churches, things like that, the capacity to adapt and modify that support through the entirety of the grief process is likely overwhelming for them. So they limit their support and say, we can help in these ways. We can help provide meals, or we can help with finances, or we can help with some part of it. But all of the nuances and the changes and the modifications, we're not prepared to ride that out with you. So we need to fit you in a little tiny box and only serve you in this small capacity, take it or leave it. Because grief is complicated and it is overwhelming, and it's not over when you want it to be. And it always lasts a little bit longer. And every person is unique. Their background is unique. Their personality is unique. The relationship with the person they lost is unique. The circumstances around the loss is unique. So there's a lot of variables there that are overwhelming to people and organizations and charities and anyone or anything that wants to reach out. And I think we even find that in individuals. I believe that people are very well-meaning, but oftentimes about 6 weeks in or so, people go on with their lives and they don't mean anything by it. It's just nobody really knows what to do. And we're constantly told as grievers, grief is your own journey. Everyone grieves differently, which is really, in my belief, a minimizing and invalidating way to say, I don't want to help you with this. You got to figure it out by yourself. This is scary to me and overwhelming to me, and it's going to require energy from me. And I'm kind of freaked out because your grief is triggering my fears. So I just want you to take your own journey. Anything goes. Where I have really taken a stand to use my voice to say, even though grief is unique for all of us, we have a lot more similarities than we do differences. There's a lot of areas that we can actually connect on. And that just because each journey is unique doesn't mean that there are not practical and tangible ways to move through that unique journey that are helpful to all of us. It really is not a free-for-all. We all do not have to just be left and abandoned to wander through and hopefully accidentally end up on the other side. There are tried and true methods that are incredibly helpful for all grievers who've experienced all different kinds of loss, who are in different areas and times in their life, that are effective for everyone. And that's the part that people don't like to hear about. Those are the two things when I say grief is not forever and that grief is not a free-for-all. There are tried and true methods that are supportive through grief across the board. Those two things often get a lot of backlash.
Yeah, I'm laughing over here because I can already say people, and especially people in early grief, they, the way I see it is that they have this understandable and to be expected coupling between the pain and the connection to the loved one, where in the beginning is very strong. And there's an unconscious or conscious, but I make it conscious usually. There's an unconscious fear that if I let go of the pain, I lose the connection to my loved one. And it takes time and grief education, the way I term it, to understand and to experience that there can be connection without that kind of intense pain. And, you know, when you were speaking about tried and true methods, I could hear people of my listeners say, okay, tell us, what is it? So share a little bit of what are your things that you have found through your own personal experience that you found helpful for those people that you serve?
Sure. So first of all, I've seen it be incredibly effective in my own life and the lives of my clients to always be willing to first start by just meeting them where they're at. If they are afraid that hurting less means loving less, then we talk about that and we work through that and we're patient with that. I don't rush my clients through anything. I don't demand that they come to any kinds of conclusions. We're just very honest and open about saying, what are you feeling and what are your worries and what's holding you back and what are your struggles? And we talk about it because sometimes just getting it out is incredibly helpful. And I don't say, oh, by the way, though, you can heal and love. I don't say that. I just say, okay, that's what's happening right now. Let's be in that place. And now let's start really taking care of ourselves, because one of the most tried and true practices through grief that I have seen work across the board in all scenarios 100% of the time is a better self-care practice, creating a self-care protocol that's going to not only support your emotional well-being, but most importantly, support your physical health under the toll of your grief, changes your perspective on your pain. Because no matter how well-intentioned we are, even if we want there to be relief or healing for us through our grief, any deeper emotional work that we're prepared or ready to do will fall short on a completely physically depleted body. Our physical health, if it's depleted, if we're run down, if we're exhausted, if we're not getting enough calories and nutrients, will resist deeper emotional work because it simply does not have the capacity to physically show up and do that work. So the very first thing we look at is, what are you eating? Are you protecting your rest? Are you taking proper supplements? Are you getting proper movement? Too much exercise is horrible during grief. No exercise is equally as horrible. So what do restorative exercises look like? What does it look like to breathe every day? How much sleep do you actually need? If you're struggling with sleep, how do we fix sleep problems so that we can protect your sleep? Are you getting enough calories? Are you getting enough nutrients? How do you cook for yourself when you're overwhelmed and depleted and the thought of getting up and into the kitchen feels overwhelming? How do we ask for help? How do we relate to others, relate to ourselves? How do we make sure that we're having boundaries and saying no to the things that don't serve us and yes to the things that do serve us, right? Our physical well-being through grief is the first focal point that I take all of my clients through. It was also the place that made the biggest difference for me when I started focusing on making sure that my body could just function under the stress of my grief. Then things like next decisions, hope, future thinking, peace, joy, any of those concepts seemed a little bit more attainable when I wasn't completely physically depleted and run down.
And I remember you were talking this about this probably in your first episode, or maybe you spoke about this on your Instagram channel, about you having the experience of doing too much exercise. I think that's a good practical example, because I have clients of mine who say, oh, I have a lot of energy and I feel that I need to, or whatever. So why don't we share a little bit about something specific where people could see, am I falling under the trap of maybe physical depletion?
Sure. So one of the biggest lessons I learned through my grief was I tried to run my grief out of me. I was always an athlete growing up, and I was a pusher and I was a striver. And so I thought, well, exercise is good for you. Exercise helps. Everyone, there's a lot of people who believe exercise is the answer to everything. So I decided that I was going to become a runner, and I was going to literally run my pain out of me. And what ended up happening was, no matter how many miles, and my sweet little 2.5-year-old son at the time would just sit in that jogging stroller for hours while his mother attempted to run her grief out of her. But the minute I would get back home and park that jogging stroller and walk in the house, my grief was right there to meet me. And it turned out it didn't matter if it was 6 miles or 12 miles or you name it. It was never enough. My grief was always waiting. And it started getting harder and harder. And I thought, oh no, I'm not doing enough. It's getting worse. I must be incapable. What's wrong with me? Do other people feel this way? When it had nothing to do with my capacity and everything to do with the fact that I was absolutely depleting myself physically. I was wearing myself down, because you cannot run every day for miles and miles and expect yourself to feel better. So I stopped. I decided that I was going to take a different approach, and I started making sure I was eating more, protected my rest. And what I discovered is that I was using exercise not as a healing mechanism, which exercise can absolutely be a healing mechanism if we use it right, but instead I was using it as a self-medicating coping mechanism. And that's where, if we examine ourselves, if you're grieving, so if you're listening to this podcast and you're grieving, it can be exceptionally helpful to do a little bit of self-reflection and say, what activities in my life are helping to cultivate healing or are just coping mechanisms? And we can often see that we're getting run down and our body is struggling, and we're struggling emotionally when we have more coping mechanisms than we do healing mechanisms. Mm-hmm. Because survival's not a bad thing. Okay. There is a season in our grief where we just have to survive, and that's okay, because it's just that hard. But I think every griever wakes up one morning and asks themselves, is there more than just survival in my life? Maybe I don't want to just survive anymore. And that was the question I asked myself when I realized, okay, if I don't want to just survive, I can't run 12 miles a day and expect it to somehow solve my grief. I can't barely eat and wonder why I'm so exhausted, depleted, and I'm not making progress. I needed to start actually doing some healing things, being more tender, being more compassionate to myself, offering myself more grace, implementing more self-care that actually strengthened me, built me up, soothed me, comforted me. I had to take really, really good care of myself. And I think there was a time when I thought trying to win my grief, beat my grief, run my grief away, my grief wasn't going to, take over my life. I was going to be stronger than my grief, was doing the exact opposite. It was creating a scenario where my pain was stronger than I was, because I was too depleted to be able to do the things that actually took good care of me. And as I took better care of my body, my bandwidth, my capacity to take better care of myself emotionally increased. And then the things that I was doing, like I did see a therapist for a little while. I started journaling. I started socializing again. I started thinking about having another baby. All of these things became so much more possible in my life because I was no longer running on empty physically. I had built myself back up a bit to even see myself as capable of building a future. Because when you're that depleted, it's incredibly difficult to see a meaningful future ahead, because who's going to build it? You could barely get out of bed.
It reminds me of the Maslow's pyramid of needs, right? When you were saying that first you have to have your physical needs met, you have to be physically stable to then go to the next level. What would be the next part that you think that was helpful for you after you looked after yourself physically?
I instituted a tea ritual in my day, every day, twice a day. I'd have 1 cup of tea in the morning. I'd have many cups of tea, but specifically 2 of them, one in the morning, one in the evening, I would use to check in. And I would sit down with myself and I would ask myself 3 questions. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling that way? And what can I do to support how I'm feeling? And that check-in process every day moved me from just physically supporting myself and getting beyond just mere survival into a mindful practice that was factoring in my mind, my heart, my emotions, my instincts, and treating me more like the whole person that I was. And that enabled me to get very clear on what was really going on inside of me and what my needs really were, so I could make an effective action plan to get my needs met. Even if it was something as simple as, I haven't seen a friend in a while, I need to call someone. And I'm an extrovert, so that was something that's very important. And I actually teach this to my clients. This is an amazing skill, actually. If you can discover if you're introverted or extroverted, it has an enormous impact on the path that you take to heal through grief, because introverts need different things than extroverts. And neither one is better or worse or right or wrong. It's just, if you're wired differently, you're going to need a different approach to support yourself. And there's confusion about introversion and extroversion, because introverts are not just shy people who want to be alone, and extroverts aren't just gregarious people who always want to be at parties. Introversion and extroversion explains how we refill our emotional energy, and grief depletes our emotional energy. So if we understand that in order to refill, we're going to need some connection with people as extroverts, or in order to refill, we're going to need some time alone as introverts, we can get ahead of that filling and make sure we're not pouring from an empty cup. And as an extrovert, I learned very quickly that I needed to be proactive in scheduling some people time into my life. And it made a huge difference. But if I wasn't checking in with myself with those cups of tea to soothe and comfort and get a gauge on where I was at, I don't know if I would have been as effective at discovering how to actually meet my needs. Because we don't want to just get stuck in our feelings. We want our feelings to inform our actions, right? Feelings don't control us. We have choices, but those choices should be rooted in the data that our feelings provide.
So it's like the 2 things that people might say to you when you're grieving. So one person might say, oh, just take time. It takes time. Basically, grieve alone, one of the myths, is probably more spoken from those who are introvert, whereas other people who say, oh, you just got to stay busy, stay strong, just come out with us and do something. This is probably more spoken from those people who are more extrovert, right? So that just made sense in terms of those people who want to support you based on what they would potentially need. What comes next?
So so once we sort of get our body supported, and then we're really checking in and understanding not just how we feel, but how those feelings inform our needs. Our needs create action steps. Then I think the next step is not only consistency in that area, but it is staying aware that our needs are going to change. And so there isn't a, since this is working for me now, it's going to work for me forever. We have to be open and flexible to seeing that it works for a while, and then we realize, oh, I have a different need, or things are changing, or I need to modify, and giving ourselves permission to make a new choice at any time, to make adjustments along the way, to change what is working from what maybe hasn't stopped working, without super intense self-judgment, without fear and trepidation, without high levels of anxiety, is really powerful, because grief is always changing. And especially when we start really experiencing healing and we transition from our season of grief into, and when I say healing, because I think semantics matter. When I say healing, I do not mean that you stop missing your loved one, the event no longer matters to you, loss no longer computes in your life, and you have overcome and you just move on like it never happened. It's not what I mean at all. When I tell my clients that my goal for them is to experience healing after loss, what I mean is, I want to equip you with the tools and the resources and the support that you need to have more power over your grief and pain than it has over you. So that at the end of the day, your grief doesn't get the final say, you do. Because our loss does change us. Our grief changes us immensely. But what I want to help my clients and what I learned how to do for myself is I get to decide how it changes me. I'm not at the mercy of my grief. I do have ways to empower myself to respond to the things that I could not control. So when I say I've experienced healing, what I mean is I still miss my girls every day. I still wonder about them and what life would be like if they were here. I often think about how different my life would be. Like, this would probably not be my career, right? And I get that. And I do miss them, and I do long for them, and I do have questions for them. It's not that I have no more feelings or emotions. And sometimes I even have difficult feelings or emotions, but I know exactly what to do for myself when I experience those feelings and emotions. Mm-hmm. And I know how to shape and influence the person that I want to be, not because of my loss, but despite my loss, because I get the final say, not my pain. And that's how I know that I have healing in my life. And that is what I hope for other people. Aubrey and Ellie are never going to disappear and no longer be part of my experience. But I get to decide how I'm going to respond to their loss so that I can become the version of myself that I want to be and build a meaningful and purposeful life. I didn't want grief to steal that from me, and I didn't want my daughter's legacy to just be their mother's pain.
Beautiful, beautifully said. I wonder what you say about that, because I often describe it as a pathway, which there is a fork, and the fork happens in the moment of devastating loss. And I'm still not 100% clear about my metaphor, but the way I so far has developed is into, so there's two paths that I see many people go down. And there's always ways to the other side. But if we're just looking at those two paths for now, it's like one side is this has happened to me, versus on the other side of the path, this has happened for me. And the way you described it before was, it's to make a choice as, is my definition of my life, as in our case, which we share, as a bereaved mother, or is my definition as, I'm a mother, and this is part of my history, and what is this doing for me? As you were saying, I would have never written 6 books. I have been a therapist before, and I'm still, but there are certain things that happened, which I call the gifts that come, which we would have gladly not received if we would have our loved ones still with us. But we have been given those gifts, or we have been given those gifts. It's questionable if we want to unwrap them or not.
Yeah, I think, I've been very vocal about, I don't believe everything happens for a reason, right? I don't think there's some innate good or lesson that's wrapped up in the loss of our child and the loss of our spouse and the most tragic and devastating things that happen to us. That we have to wait till it reveals itself at some point, and we'll see why all of this had to happen. I believe that life is about choices. And my really good friend, Amy Lands, who's also an author and is absolutely a wonderful human and in the grief space as well, we used to talk about this a lot. And one of the things she always said to me is, people ask her, well, what if her daughter's name is Ruthie Lou? What if Ruthie Lou had lived? What if? And she would say, that wasn't the question I had to answer. That wasn't the choice I was given. I wasn't given a choice of keeping her or losing her. I was only given the choice of, since I lost her, what do I do now? And that was very much the way that I looked at it. I didn't search for some inherent purpose or meaning or some way this was all going to make sense. I just saw that before me was a choice to pursue healing and life after loss, or a choice to let Aubrey and Ellie's death define me and control my future. And I decided, it wasn't revealed to me, it wasn't cosmic, it was really just a choice that I made, that I wanted to pursue healing. And I had 2 very specific reasons for that. One was I had a beautiful 2.5-year-old little boy who I wanted to have a healthy mother. It wasn't his fault. His sisters died either. And I didn't want him taking the brunt of that. But even more importantly than my love for him, I wasn't ready to just be done living my life. I was 28 years old and I believed that I had more life to live, more to contribute, something beyond this. And I wasn't prepared to have this be the final say, right? Have this define the rest of my existence. And so, yes, I chose healing for my child, but I'll be honest, I also chose healing for myself. And I think that's really important as a griever to get to a place where you're not doing it for anyone, even for our loved one, right?
Exactly.
Yes, I wanted Aubrey and Ellie to have a legacy. I love them dearly. But I also had to choose to heal for myself. It couldn't be just for them, and it couldn't be just for my son, and it couldn't be for anyone alone, right? It had to be for me too. And making that choice, because that was the only choice I was given. I wasn't given a choice to keep them. Some things in life really are out of our control. And that's what's hard about grief, is it exposes the areas that we truly are powerless over. And that can be very scary, and it can upset our belief systems, and it can remind us that we're vulnerable.
Yes.
But in that vulnerability, that ability to make a choice helps empower us to respond to the things that we can control, instead of allow the things we can't control to define who we are and the life that we choose to live.
Yeah, it brings up existential issues, existential questions in terms of, is this life fair? And if not, or if it's supposedly not because someone hasn't been able to live longer or what we wish for them, what do we do about that? And what if there's not even a question of fairness, it just is? So for those of you who wanted to listen to Amy's story, she's season 2, episode 15. So just mentioned Amy Lance. That's a really good episode to listen to. So to round this up today, what would you say from your experience of working, first of all, of your personal experience, but also the length of time that you've been working with people in life after loss coaching? What would you wish for them to know? What would be some tangible steps that they could take to practice and to experiment with, to see what it would do if someone is listening to that and just wants to know, how do I deal with my grief and my loss? What would you recommend as a first step?
The best first step is to tend to yourself right where you're at, and feed yourself, rest yourself. We don't need to have our whole grief journey solved the day that we experience loss. It's okay to be patient with yourself and meet your most immediate needs. Pour a cup of tea. Say no to things so that you can stay in a little bit more and protect your energy and your rest. Ask for some help. Reach out to people. I need you to be around, or I need some help with life, or I need some grace and patience, right? Talk to your employer or advocate for yourself just based on where you are right now. You don't have to solve every single future problem because I think as a griever, that was exactly the first place I went to, is what does this mean for the rest of my life? And that's an enormous question to answer. And when I set aside trying to figure out what this means for the rest of my life and just started answering, what does this mean for today? What does this mean for today? How do I take care of myself today? And at the beginning, it was very practical. I feed myself. I pour a cup of tea. I stand outside for a bit, take a couple deep breaths and get some sun on my face. I don't expect too much. I don't judge myself. My feelings are my feelings. They're not right or wrong. They're not good or bad. I shouldn't or should feel any certain way. And I just gave myself a lot of grace to be, to exist, and to take it 1 minute at a time, 1 hour at a time, 1 day at a time. The pressure to figure out what does this mean for the rest of my life took a back seat, and I could breathe a little and I could listen to myself a little bit better, because that's too big of a question. It's too big of a question in general, let alone when you are grieving. That's an impossible ask. So I shifted my expectations into just doing the actual, practical, tangible, meaningful things I could do right then in that moment. I could hold a warm cup of tea and sip it and smell it and be present for a minute and do something that comforted and soothed me right then and there, without having to know, what does this mean for the rest of my life?
And to end this from my side, I think one of the most important things that I get to feel and hear and see again and again when I have discovery sessions with clients, like the first meeting that I have, is to say, in the words of the person that I met today, is all I can do at the moment is breathe. And
Absolutely.
That is hard in the beginning, but to be conscious about that is so important, to take that time to yourself. And what I wish for anyone who's listening is that if you don't know how to advocate for yourself, that you have the support or find the support that can do that for you or can hold your hand in the storm, which is here right now in your life.
There really are a lot of wonderful people who are capable of providing amazing support to grievers.
So thank you so much for today, Rachel. Thank you so much. For everyone who wants to find out more about Rachel, you'll find all the links as usual in the show notes. Go and reach out to Rachel. Also check out her Instagram channel. She offers a great deal of support in her reels. And be sure to get support if you need it, personal or in whatever way that feels right for you. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.